everyone. My name is Collen Johnson. I am the CEO of ProKanban.org, and welcome to our second edition of Kanban for Everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about Kanban for UX, and I am so excited about our guests. We are joined today by Jeff Gothelf and John Coleman. I don't think either of you need any introductions at all, but for folks who may not know you or may not have read your books or heard your podcasts, let's start with some introductions. John, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me to the show, Colleen. I'm essentially a Scrum.org trainer, a ProKanban.org trainer, and I'm very involved with Lean UX as well. I delivered some workshops with Joshua, and I'm delighted to meet Jeff here today as well, talking about Lean UX and how we can get Kanban and UX to work together.
Wonderful. Thanks, John. And Jeff?
Hey, folks. Colleen, thanks for having me. John, nice to see you as well. I'm Jeff Gothelf. I was a UX designer for a long time, a product manager. I co-wrote Lean UX with Josh Seiden and another book with Josh called Sense and Respond. And for the last, 8-9 years now, I've been working as a solo practitioner, consulting, training, speaking with companies about Lean UX, product discovery, product management, OKRs, organizational agility, all the stuff that folks know they should be doing but struggle to make happen.
Yeah. Highly recommend Sense and Respond to, well, both of your books, but Sense and Respond is one of my favorite Agile books. If you want to put it in that bucket. It's a great book, especially for leaders of the organization to read.
Thank you.
Well, we're going to dig in today and talk about UX and how Kanban can help, what you guys have tried. I'm excited about this. I feel like over the course of my career, I see a lot of, it seems like we're all trying. I mean, everybody's trying to figure out how to make all of this work well together with other practices inside the organization, whether that's Scrum or SAFe or Kanban. But I feel like UX is often the one that gets left out of that shuffle, right? There's no guidebook for how this is supposed to look, unfortunately. So it's a little bit of trial and error. Let's start by just talking about what common things we see for UX practitioners, UX teams, and how they, what are the pain points for them in trying to apply Agile practices to how they work. John, you want to open that up with what you've seen?
Sure. One of the most obvious ones would be the conflation that UI and UX are the same thing. And it's almost regrettable at this point that people use those two expressions in the same term as though they're the same, because it can kind of give the impression that the UX researchers are just creating the widgets for the developers kind of thing. So that would be one of the kind of things that I see. And the other struggle I think that a lot of people have is, how do you blend discovery and delivery? And does everything that you discover necessarily need to be delivered? They'd be the main things that I've noticed.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think I've seen some similar pain points there with the discovery cycles, where it's like everything that we do discovery on makes it into the delivery funnel. So it's like a little bit of discovery theater, if you will, where nothing ever exits that process. And then it's like, are we really giving ourselves a chance to do true discovery if everything makes it across the line? Great. Definitely. How about you, Jeff? What have you seen?
Yeah, so the interesting thing from my perspective, coming up through a UX career, is that, look, design, research, UX were not ever really explicitly mentioned in the Agile Manifesto, in the Scrum, in the original Scrum guides. These are activities that have become, increasingly more crucial and these days essential to the success of digital products and services, but they were never included in the conversation. So it's always felt like I'm going to say we, but as UX practitioners, product managers, and progressive, enlightened, mature, forward-thinking engineering teams, that we've been playing catch-up, right? Like trying to figure out sort of, okay, how do we insert ourselves into this situation? And how do we insert ourselves into this situation? And what's interesting about that is that's one way to have that conversation, and it's an interesting conversation. And then the other way to have the conversation, which is more difficult, is how do we change and evolve the process so that it's cross-functional and discipline diverse? And I think that becomes that, which is, that's a more difficult conversation, because a lot of folks are like, well, Agile, this is Agile, and, we're not changing it, right? And so that's a big conversation, right? How do we fit into the original process, or how do we evolve the process to just be more reflective of modern software development, right? Those things have changed over the last 20 years. And then I'll double down on the discovery and the delivery piece. This is really hard. In fact, I was working with a team earlier today, and that was a big topic of conversation, which is to say, most teams, sadly, today are still measured on their velocity of delivery, like how many points, how many features, how many widgets can you get launched, whereas that's not an indicator of value, right? We don't know that delivering that feature will necessarily deliver the kind of value that we're looking for to the user, to the business, and so forth. And so then how do you balance discovery work, which inevitably eats away at the velocity of delivery, with quality delivery work? And that's a big challenge, huge challenge still to this day.
Yeah, and do you find that the practices just don't exist to have that discovery process early, or that we're doing it too late and it's too close to what we're doing in the delivery process to really have an impact?
I think everyone's aware that they should be doing it. Like, I don't think that's like, it's not like I walk into a company and they're like, wait, what? We should talk to customers? We should run, like, they know they should run experiments and they should talk to customers. I think that the challenge for them is, is knowing how to do it. They know they should, right? So I would start with, do you know how to do it? That's number one. I think that's a fair question. Not all organizations do. And I think the second challenge is, if you know how to do it, are you allowed to do it? Right? Do you have, are you, like, is there permission for you to do this without getting into trouble? Who does it? How does it integrate? What do we do with the insight that we generate? And so I think those are the two sides of it. I don't think it's an awareness issue. I don't think you'll find anybody who'll be like, I've never heard of talking to customers. That makes no sense, right? Like, no one is going to say that, I hope, right?
Yeah. No, and I think it's sometimes it feels a little bit like an investment issue, right? And I think I've heard Jeff Patton say in the past that production's the most expensive place for us to test an idea, but it's where we typically do, right? It's like companies will say, we don't want to invest the money early on in the process to have all of these people trying to talk to customers. But we're really probably spending a lot more to find out that it's the wrong thing if we're getting it all the way to production to get there.
For sure.
John, I know you teach Scrum with UX classes through scrum.org, and that's a fairly new offering. Is that true?
Yeah, it's been around for, I'm not sure, is it 2 or 3 years now, and it's my favorite of the Scrum.org workshops, because it opens up a whole set of possibilities, and what Scrum really should have been all about from the very start, which is not just delivering, but also discovering to deliver, and also maybe even looking at the problem space sometimes. And what most people discover when they go through that is that actually, in a Scrum context, a UX person, for example, let's say UX designer, researcher person who's got real skills in that area, the expectation is that they would coach, mentor, teach non-UXers on the team how to do that type of stuff. The non-UXers wouldn't necessarily ever be as good as the person who specializes in it, but they can do some things. They can take notes. They can do low fidelity, high fidelity prototypes and things like that. And that's kind of one of the eureka moments that people have, and they realize, and they can actually make the work visible on the product backlog in Scrum, and on the sprint backlog, and in all the events. They can talk about, I'm going to meet a customer today. Does anybody want to come along and take some notes? And these little simple things. And at the sprint review, for example, the big changes, not only are we looking at what we're thinking of releasing next and what we released during the sprint, but what are the results of some interviews that we had with customers, and what are the results of some experiments, and is that changing our thinking about whether we're on the right track? So that really improves the empirical loop in Scrum. But the common theme, though, when I do the workshop is that when we get to the end of it, most people don't use Scrum with UX. Most people use Kanban with UX. At least in the footprint, the area that I've interacted with. When I use Scrum with UX myself, but it's just in terms of when I ask people what they're using, it tends to be Kanban as the basic management system, if you like, to kind of see where the work is, and then they're using Lean UX or design thinking or some kind of process like that to to kind of help them to discover the value more easily.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's dig into that. Why do you think that is? I mean, I think you touched on a couple interesting topics here, John. I mean, I think the involvement you mentioned from getting the teams closer to talking about what experimentation are we doing, what interviews are we doing, what's the output of those is a really interesting piece. And you kind of touched on this as being maybe, I don't know if it's solved by Kanban, but helped by Kanban by creating some visibility into what's happening in UX. What other things do you see as a dotted line kind of between those Kanban practices that are helping solve some of those problems with UX?
Yeah, thank you, Colleen. So in Kanban, we have 3 basic practices coming up with the definition of workflow, which is essentially the Kanban board. And then you actively manage the work in the system, which is everything. If anything's getting slow, you try to stop starting, start finishing, and then you review the design of your board every now and again. And these 3 practices, along with the 4 flow metrics, really help you to improve the signaling about what's going on. And Kanban's very good at encouraging you maybe to right size your work. You wouldn't bring an elephant you wouldn't bring a big massive work item into the team. You'd say, well, does this feel like an item we can get done quickly? And if not, we need to break it down. But where Lean UX takes that a bit further is we're thinking more about, hang on a second, what problem are we trying to solve here? And the Lean UX canvas is a wonderful practical piece of work produced by Jeff and supported by Josh, and it's got an 8-box canvas, and essentially what problem you're trying to solve and what outcomes you're looking for from different points of view. Who are we aiming this at in terms of, we use the expression proto-persona so we don't kind of get confused with the marketing personas, the advertising personas. And then how do we know we kind of solved those problems? And then it's only then we get into what the potential solutions might be, the prototypes and so on. And then the latter half of the canvas is about how can we find out if we're on the right track? Because the problem we're trying to solve, the assumptions in terms of outcomes, who we're aiming this at, and the solutions, they're all assumptions. And so we can, what Jeff and Joshua have done a great job of, they've basically put together a template for a hypothesis that is like clicking together boxes 1 through 5 into like Lego bricks together. And Alakazam, you've got a hypothesis, you've got a whole set of hypotheses actually. And you can then, in boxes 7 and 8, they just basically looking at what's the riskiest of these assumptions, and so what's the next most important thing that we need to learn. And it's constant iterative process reviewing that. You run typically, by the way, what I notice is even when people use the Lean UX canvas, I did this with 240 people in a university earlier in the year, and a lot of them demonstrated execution bias, even though the experiments were telling them that they were on the wrong track. They didn't pivot, they didn't stop, they persevered. And it was only a few teams actually that had that discipline to really use evidence. And so the combination of Kanban and Lean UX is really powerful. But where Scrum and UX is falling down and where Kanban helps is visualizing the different time horizons. So what about that stuff that we released 2 sprints ago or 2 months ago? What about the stuff we're doing at the moment that we're thinking of releasing next? What about those experiments that we're doing to discover whether the next thing is the next thing?
Yeah.
I think the 3 time horizons can really be properly visualized in Kanban, and Kanban can also help as well to have better interactions and understanding about where all that work is.
Yeah. Absolutely. As you were talking about kind of the 3 practices of Kanban, I was thinking, I think maybe we could have a secret 4th one that is sense and respond. We should have one that is sense and respond, because really, I think what you're driving towards there is that concept of feedback loops, and everything that we're doing should drive some kind of action, right? It's not that we're running all this and it's a dead end. It's the goal here is that we're using everything we're doing to help decide what to do next. So Jeff, how about from your end? What do you see as some of the benefits of applying Kanban practices with UX?
So this is really interesting, right? And so I've kind of got a reaction and actually a question for John as well, because just him being the Kanban expert at this. So look, visualizing the work is critical, right? This is one of the key things that we talk about with these teams, and because everybody's comfortable visualizing engineering work. There's no real big surprise in there about we're going to write tickets or user stories or whatever it is. We're going to manage them in whatever tool we use. But visualizing the rest of the work is still a challenge for a lot of folks, right? How do I write a separate card for the design part of it, for the research part of it, and then managing all that work in progress becomes really interesting, because what constitutes a unit of work, right? And we talk about this a lot in the PSU, right? So in the professional Scrum with UX course, when we try to talk about backlog management, right, you can visualize the work completely separately, right? So you can have sort of development work visualized over here, and everything else, we'll just call it sort of UX or design or discovery over here, right? And that's an anti-pattern. The anti-pattern is the division of labor, two separate teams, lack of shared understanding, no cross-pollination between those two. So let's you can take that at face value, you can argue with me, but let's assume that that's an anti-pattern for the sake of this, right? If our other choices, we have at least two other choices, at least, probably more, but at least two, right? We can have one backlog with separate, or sort of one backlog with where every item of work is visualized separately. So there's a development task, there's a research task, a design task, maybe there's a tech spike, whatever it is, right? And then a third option is, well, we've got these items of work that have the entirety of the work that needs to get done within them: design, development, research, UX, whatever, right? It's all in there. And so I think the interesting challenge here for the sort of the Kanban, and I'd love to get John's thoughts about this, is how do you visualize the work? Because you know the PSU material, I know the PSU material. We know that we try to push people towards the integrated story, the story that holds all the work within one unit of work. But then visualizing that successfully and then managing work in progress, especially when there's multiple people kind of picking out tasks from that story. What have you seen as an effective, like how can you apply Kanban to make that more successful? Because I think a lot of folks that I know a lot of folks that I work with struggle with that aspect of it.
Sure, thanks, Jeff. So first of all, in Kanban, each work item needs to be valuable, and we're pretty clear about what value means, and kind of customer value, end user value, societal value, organizational, but learning is in there as well. And so just like one of your preferred options there, where you said you'd have separate product backlog items, maybe an item for an interview. You might have a separate work item in Kanban for having an interview with a customer, or for doing a particular hypothesis, or running an experiment based on a hypothesis. You can also use a blended approach, but as you mentioned, the signaling gets more difficult on a Kanban board, because work items, as they move across the board, they need to be valuable. And so it's completely okay to have subtasks maybe on the face of the card saying these are all the things we need to do, but now we've discovered extra stuff. But a popular pattern that I've noticed is, let's imagine you've got a work in progress column for your team. Because discovery in UX is never finished, and because we're always learning stuff, instead of kind of going discovery, development, delivery, what I've seen lately is a swim lanes for each of those, where you might have discovery, development, delivery, and the items are moving up and down between the swim lanes, which solves a Kanban problem, because on a Kanban board, we want the cards to move from left to right. We don't want them going backwards really on the board. It's kind of an anti-pattern, because from a flow metric point of view, it kind of upsets things. And what's really nice about using a swim lane approach as well, Jeff, is that you get to see the heat, particularly if you use an electronic tool. You can see, oh wow, there's a lot of stuff going on in discovery at the moment, and you can have blended items. You can do, you can also do a combination, Jeff. You could have separate items for discovery, separate for development, delivery. You can have blended, and you can have a mix and match of both as well. But as you said, we probably wouldn't have separate. But just to remind the audience, in Kanban, backlog is optional. You don't have to have a backlog. So literally what you could do is, you could work on something with a customer. You do your discovery, then we shouldn't do that actually. So we discover a much better idea. Like I interviewed John Carter from Bose a couple of weeks ago, and when they were trying to invent these noise cancelling headphones in my head, they were actually looking for higher quality sound. They were just higher fidelity sound, and they accidentally discovered the noise cancellation aspect of the headphones. And so when they did their discovery, they thought, oh, and then they created a new work item for, okay, we need to pivot here because actually we discovered something new. And then they had delivered based on that. And even though in the Scrum UX course, Jeff, there's a kind of a bias towards blending the items, my own personal preference is to split the items, because I typically see, for the reason I mentioned earlier, execution bias, where people go on to deliver what was discovered. And I like there to be kind of, as David Marquet would say, let's do some blue work here. Let's step back and reflect. Do we have enough evidence here that we should actually develop this? And it kind of gives you a checkpoint, but it's just an opinion, Jeff.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think about that.
I think it's interesting, right? Look, so from a work management perspective, it seems to make sense in the way you describe it, like to kind of separate the tasks. Because look, if I'm doing a research task or a design task or whatever it is, and I'm done, if it's not part of a bigger unit of work, then that card can keep moving forward, right? The interesting thing that happens, and this is something that I see with teams, is that when they try to blend into one unit of work that contains the entirety of the work for the thing that the team is working on, what if we finish and the other people on the team aren't done, right? Designers are done and the devs aren't, or vice versa, or whatever it is, and we're at work in progress, like we're at our WIP limit, right?
Yeah, and people start playing games as well with the items. Oh, the item's taking very long, the cycle is very long. Also, let's split the item. And they kind of lose the plot a little bit.
Yeah.
And at least if you did your discovery, there is value in the learning, as long as they got some learning. We meet the customer. What was the result of the experiment? What did we learn? And then you get some value from that. But if they're just splitting the items for the sake of splitting the items because, they're just trying to split up the work, and actually now we don't understand where the value is anymore, that's where people kind of go a little bit crazy. So yeah, I think actually, Jeff, the more we talk about it from a Kanban point of view, splitting items would be my bias, to avoid funny games in terms of flow metrics, but also to discourage execution bias, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting approach. And hearing you talk about it, John, I was remembering a time where we were trying to build out a portfolio Kanban, and we were really getting stuck on, is it discover, define, discover? Where does design fit into that? Because it tends to be a circular pattern there, right? Where you're moving back and forth between those different phases.
Exactly.
That particular team decided to scrap all the terms and went with the stages of beer fermentation, so we could just focus on the activities underneath each stage. And that way, you could be doing some definition and some discovery and some design work, and it was just that first stage of the beer fermentation process until we were ready to get it to the next part. And I really liked that because it kept everybody focused on the exit policies and the activities instead of the title of the column. Super. We tend to, doesn't matter what level we're looking at, we get stuck there.
Indeed, yeah.
Jeff, you mentioned WIP limits as part of this, and that was also something that stood out in both of the scenarios you described. I think, when we think about Kanban, we tend to focus on team level WIP limits, but I feel like there's a conversation emerging here around WIP limits at other levels of the organization too. From a UX perspective, where do you think WIP limits fit in? Is it something that's needed when you're doing research to be able to really narrow your focus? And I'll kick that one to you, Jeff.
So look, I believe in WIP limits. Let me start there. Okay. So I believe that they are good and a fabulous constraint for forcing us to, as John said earlier, to start finishing and stop starting. That said, the interesting thing here is I don't, my gut says that if you, the risk of setting different WIP limits for different disciplines or different types of tasks, we're going to end up in that situation where designers are going to be working sprints ahead of engineers. So, we did the research, we did the experiment, we did the thing. Here's the data. Okay, we'll see you later. We're going. I feel like we need whatever work in progress limits we put into place. I feel like they need to be team level. That's my gut instinct, just or somehow constrained in a way that we don't let one discipline run way ahead of another. So a little bit ahead, a day or two, half a sprint, whatever it is, it's fine. But like sprints ahead is we're back to waterfall, right? And so to me, it feels like there needs to be some sort of thought about how we support this. Now, look, years ago, and I'm talking about like 15 years ago, one of the ways that we sort of maintained consistent team level WIP limits was that the discovery work, I mean, sure, the actual design work was done by designers, like putting pixels on a screen, making wireframes, whatever it is. But the discovery work, the research, the conversations, the experiments, the prototyping, what have you, those were always handled by two people. So maybe there was a designer attached to it, but there was a product manager or there was an engineer or somebody along those lines. And that was a highly successful way of, one, visualizing the work, two, making all the work a first-class citizen of the team's backlog. I'll say backlog. And third, it was exposing people who would normally not be exposed to the customer, to data, to insight, to the rationale behind a lot of the decision making, directly to those people, to build empathy, to build understanding, to build support for ideas, and to help them do their own jobs better. And that was a successful technique that it's funny, we were doing this 15 years ago. I rarely see it. And I work, to be fair, I work primarily with large organizations, like very large multinational organizations. I rarely see it inside those organizations, because large companies have a lot of people, they can afford to specialize, and they're like, these are our specialists who do this, and they should not be doing that. But to me, that was an effective way of essentially distributing the work that could be done by multiple folks to multiple folks, and that kind of helped constrain the team within a time box of some kind, or even just within a WIP limit, like if given that we're talking about Kanban.
Yeah, I think and hearing you talk about that too, I see often a lot of organizations where if that is a separate role, where it's either product strategy or some kind of customer research role that's separate from product, we start to see that there's usually an imbalance in the amount of resources or the amount of people dedicated to that work that's very different from the amount of teams doing delivery. And so there's a little bit of that, like we talked about, that kind of discovery theater where you have two people doing discovery work for 20 Scrum teams or 20 Kanban teams, and they can't keep pace, right? And so it's like, how do you pull back from that and start to look at the big picture and the overlap there, or WIP limits at the portfolio level to help balance all of that out. Yep. John, I'd love to chat a little bit about how this connects at the portfolio level. So when you start to look at an organization and how to help them first kick off this organization of discovery to delivery, what are the first things you start to try to help them with?
The very first thing is transparency of the work, and just to follow up the discussion that you both had just a while ago in terms of learning. One of the things that happens initially when we visualize all of the discovery work, all of the development delivery work, is there's a collective jaw-dropping moment when people realize how much discovery work there is. It's like, oh, you do all this stuff? And I'm going to say something controversial here, because one of the things that people realize is that there's so much discovery work that the learning tends to be more the non-discovery folks learning about discovery as opposed to the other way around. Because some months will be heavily discovery oriented, and some of them will be heavily delivery development oriented, and some of them will be a bit of a mix. And that roller coaster of switching from one set of work to another can wreak chaos, and in worst case scenario can lead to the work not being done as we would expect, getting it done professionally, dividing up poor UX people like pizzas when there are people at the end of the day who's got really good skills, and put a good person in a bad situation, you're not going to get good results. So the first thing is just making transparency there, and I would encourage an expression, I call it mob UX. So you might have heard of Woody Zool talking about mob programming, and you hear about people doing mob documentation. I encourage, because we discover there is so much UX, and I say to the team, the Kanban system members, we got to get real here. There's a bit of one-way learning that we might need, and so we might need to do some mobbing on UX, and you might be uncomfortable, doing these things you've never done before, but you can do all of the knowledge transfer in the world, but the best way to learn is to do somebody else's job. And so we kind of do that. So leave that aside. We might do pairing, mobbing, swarming, but that's usually the first discovery, forgive the pun, that, oh, wow, what are we going to do with this?
Yeah.
And so each team or set of Kanban system members would have their own board. In a situation, Colleen, where the UXers are in some kind of center of excellence, which I sometimes call a center of arrogance. I'm making a bit of a joke there, where the poor people, they're put into one place to serve everybody. That's a difficult situation. But if that's the reality, I visualize their work on their board and how their work is interacting with work on other boards. So you might have a coordination board. In flight levels, they call it a flight level 2 system, where you can see from the customer request to customer delivery, these are all the boards that the work goes through, and this is what happens. And sometimes it goes here, sometimes it goes there, and you're just visualizing that on a kind of a very long value stream type portfolio board. And then higher up above that, again, the flight levels, people will call it a flight level 3 board. We might call it a strategic board, where we're talking about what are the next bets that we're thinking of bringing in. And we need to be careful about, hang on a second, let's look at the coordination level first. There's a lot of work in progress going on there, so let's be careful about bringing more stuff in. Let's leave that calm down first before we bring any more in. And what you'll see probably, Colleen and Jeff, at the coordination level, you will see the mess of dependencies between the different skill sets, whether there's UX people in the actual teams themselves, or whether UXers are in their own dedicated centers, if you like. We will see the mess, but then we can have the discussions about how do we swarm around that mess. We can see there's a lot of heat in a particular area of the coordination board. What are we going to do? What interactions do we need? Maybe they don't necessarily need to be synchronous. There might be, I use Loom, for example, and I literally record on a video on Loom, and I send it out, and people then comment and reply with their own video, and we can interact during the day about what's going on with the work. And so we're trying to manage the work, not the people doing the work, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think you have both talked about how do we get the people doing the work as close as possible to understanding the problem we're trying to solve. And a lot of times in big organizations that falls apart quickly, right? Even if we have the best UX practices, keeping that thread through to what are we trying to do, and anchoring even post delivery and revisiting, are we achieving that goal, can be really difficult. And I think that's where when we start to look at like sense and respond in this big feedback loop, that becomes critical, and folding that back in. Jeff, what do you typically recommend for teams and how they keep that consistency? And I know at the beginning you talked about OKRs and strategic outcomes. How do we stay anchored to why are we doing this in the first place?
Yeah. So John was kind enough to give a very thorough overview of the Lean UX canvas earlier. And there are components in there that do help us stay anchored to why we're doing this. So the problem state, the box number 1 in the canvas, is the problem statement, which is literally answering the question, why are we working on this? What's the problem we're trying to solve? Why do we care about it? How do we know it's a problem? And if we solve it, how will we know, right? And it's not if we solve it, what will we ship? Right? It's if we solve it, how will we know? And that is one of those things. And it's really interesting because John talked, again, he talked a lot about the canvas, and I teach the canvas on a weekly basis. And, typically people will write decent problem statements with our guidance. They do a good job. By the time they get to solution hypotheses, so it's kind of to the end of they have forgotten the problem that they're solving. And so one of the things that we want to do as good product managers, scrum masters, leaders on a team, generally speaking, is to kind of always bring us back to the problem, right? The problem statement. What are we solving for? Remember? And then who are we solving it for, right? Because every value chain is going to have a variety of players in it. And in all likelihood, we're not focused on all of them all at once. Generally speaking, it's 1 or 2, and then maybe another 1 or 2. And so let's focus on who we're solving, what problem we're solving, and who we're solving it for. And then secondarily, and this is to me the fundamental, there's a reason why OKRs are having their moment in the sun right now. And to me, I believe that if done well, objectives and key results do a lot of things, but it's one of the two things that they do is they are an anchor to the why. They kind of keep us, like, to answer your question, anchor us to the why. And the other is they sort of explicitly demand agility. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So if we think about OKRs, an objective is qualitative. It's the goal of the team or the business unit or the business, but it's qualitative. We want to become the easiest to use online furniture shopping site in France, something like that, right? That's the kind of objective. Terrific. The key results are the behavior changes that we're looking for in the system that tell us that we are the easiest to use online furniture shopping site in France, right? So people are coming to the site, they're coming back, they're buying a lot of stuff, they're buying multiple times, they're telling their friends, et cetera, all those types of activities. Those key results are the measures of success. The behavior change becomes the measure of success. And the way that it typically, that if done well, right, those key results become a filter for the work. So as we have all kinds of work that we come up with, that we discover as we do our research, that our executives are sort of lobbying in from the outside into our backlogs of work, we have this filter, this OKR filter that sits on top of our backlog. And that's our first question. Will this help us achieve the behavior change we're focused on for this quarter, let's just say, right? Do we believe, right? We don't know, right? But do we believe that it'll help us? And if the answer is yes, terrific, we'll consider this work. And if the answer is no, then it's hey, not now, right? Currently, we're focused on these behavior changes. We'll focus on that later. So that really helps the team sort of build this kind of continuous conversation with all the people who are dependent on it around what they're trying to achieve. We're trying to change behavior this way because that tells us that we've solved this problem. Now, the other benefit here, as I mentioned, is that it sort of explicitly demands agility from the team, because neither the objective nor the key result, and frankly, the problem statement also, right? None of those things talk about solutions. None of those things talk about what we're going to build. They talk about solving a problem and changing behavior. And so that means that the team now has to go do discovery work. They have to go discover the best combination of code, copy, design, value proposition, business model that will solve the problem and achieve the behavior change, the key results. Inevitably, the team is going to be right about some things and wrong about some things. And the measure of right and wrong isn't I like it, the boss likes it, my mom thinks it's cool, right? The measure of right and wrong is, did we change the behavior? And if we didn't, if we continue to try to iterate on this thing and we can't get the behavior change to happen, then we have to change course, right? And changing course based on evidence is agile, right? It's being agile, right? It's the adjective, agile organization. And to me, that's one of the biggest benefits here of staying connected to the why and staying connected to agility as a team, because you can make an objective case for the course correction. Right? I know we told you we're going to work on solution A, but the more we experiment on it, we realize that solution A is not going to get us the behavior change we're looking for. So we're shifting gears to solution B. And here's why: because our early stage experiments, our discovery work, is telling us that this stands a greater chance of success. Right? At the very least, you can make that evidence-based case. Your boss might still poo all over it, but at least you can make an evidence-based case for the course correction.
Yeah, and you talked about something really important in that scenario where there's a piece of being wrong, right? Our hypothesis was wrong, the solution is wrong. Let's talk about that for a minute, because I see a lot of organizations where that doesn't get shared out, or it gets ignored, I guess, in some ways too. It's like we run the experiment, we don't get great feedback, but we've already got a solution that's in our feature roadmap that's going to get built either way. What recommendations do you have for organizations that are getting involved with UX, starting to run these experiments and understand what hypothesis and how they go about sharing when they've proven it wrong, right? How do you bring that back?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is the hardest part, right? So there's a whole conversation around psychological safety that we don't have time for today, but I'll just touch on it at the service level very briefly, is that the organization has to provide the environment for people to feel comfortable raising their hand and saying, hey, this is wrong, regardless of whose idea it was. And that's a massive challenge. I work with lots of organizations where people are terrified of their bosses, of their colleagues, of, their boss's boss, especially if it was the boss's idea and that type of thing. The reality is we're all wrong all the time, right? It's just a matter of being transparent about it. So I think as a leader, if we look at it from the kind of the positive side of things, I'll give you two things. If you're in any kind of a leadership position, even like Scrum Master, product manager, product owner, right? One of those sort of team leadership roles, be transparent when you're wrong, right? Show the team that it's okay. Hey, you know what? Last week we prioritized the backlog in this way, but the evidence that we've picked up over the last week actually contradicts that. I know that was my idea. I was wrong. Let's fix that. All you're doing is you're modeling the behavior you want to see from your team. I think that goes a long way. So modeling, so just showing that it's okay, I think is, if you're in any kind of position to do that, goes a long way. I think the second thing that would be really helpful is to start small, right? So if someone says, we're building this whole new thing, or like if the project is enormous, is there an opportunity to take one of the small assumptions in there, one that won't necessarily break the project, but will steer it in a slightly more accurate direction, and experiment on that, and then say, hey, look, you know what? We learned that the direction that we chose is slightly wrong. So we're going to shift this way, and that's going to get us back this much time, this much money, this much KR, whatever it is, right? Hey, did you like the way that worked? We could scale that up to this other thing, right? And so you're kind of building evidence for the practice and showing that it's not scary to be wrong by starting small. So those are at least two things that come to mind for me.
Yeah. How about for you, John?
Yeah, so this is kind of interesting. The conventional wisdom would be you'd kind of run one experiment at a time and you look at the results, and the reason for that is so if you change something, where the results came from. One of the problems with that, though, that I've seen, and best exemplified by a large bank I worked with a few years ago, there was an innovation team that a kind of a thing called a pitch Friday. All the innovators come together and they do a big pitch, and I asked them, I said, so what happens in this Pitch Friday thing? Like if this idea is a dud, like what do you do? Well, my performance has been associated with how good the pitch is, so I'm still going to say it's a good thing. And this is the cultural problem that we have. And so it depends on the culture that you're in. In some situations, what I do is I recommend multiple parallel experiments so that there's a little bit more safety to say that one or two of those didn't quite work out. Or even better, we actually discovered something accidentally. We ran the experiment, we didn't get the expected results, but wow, we noticed something, this thing we didn't think anybody would like, but people actually love it. It's like an accidental discovery. And what I kind of encourage in those kind of environments where the culture isn't fantastic is trying to create a situation where people are feeling more comfortable, that there's so much going on that actually we understand that some of these are going to fail. Whereas if they have one experiment, they're probably going to say it's okay, even though it's not okay. That's just it's got nothing to do with the science. It's more to do with psychology, if that makes sense, and psychological safety. It's a tricky one.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I see that we've got some guests from Barcelona. Let's see, London, Amsterdam. Ireland, Germany. We've got folks from all over the world joining us right now, and I would love to open it up for some viewer questions. You can add those right from LinkedIn where you're watching us now. And while we're waiting for a few of these questions to show up that I can read off to you both, maybe just some closing thoughts here around where you think folks can get started to learn more about how Kanban could help them.
So first of all, in terms of trying to find out more about Kanban, you can check out kanbanguys.org and the wonderful ProKanban community. Essentially, at prokanban.org, they've really simplified Kanban down to its essence. So they've got it right down to the minimum. And if you want to start somewhere, it's a great place to start. Also, check out Jeff's and Joshua's book, what's called Lean UX, the third edition, and also Sense and Respond. The third edition book is the most recent book. Is that right, Jeff? Is that your most
correct.
recent book?
That's correct. Yeah.
And maybe also check out the Lean UX Canvas as well. Literally, if you just do a Google search for Lean UX Canvas, comes up straight away. You can download a PDF, and it's such a practical tool, but you probably need to get yourself trained on how to apply it, because in the wrong hands, you might think it's a one and done thing. It's actually an iterative thing, constant learning, constantly going back to what the problem is, and so on and so forth. They'd be my tips, Colleen.
Great. Thanks, John. I should have probably prefaced that question by saying you don't have to plug ProKanban, even though we appreciate it. But really, for anyone in the UX space, where can they get started helping their organizations break things down smaller, like you said, creating great hypotheses and understanding how to validate these experiments. And Jeff, I know you shared the link with everybody for the Lean Canvas. Any other references or things that you think would be helpful for our audience?
I mean, look, all the material for us was heavily inspired by the Lean Startup. So if at this point, if you haven't read the Lean Startup, like 11 years later, 12 years later, that's a good time. It's a good foundation, and it's a good kind of in these concepts, and then really trying to kind of extrapolate it out into, well, how do I think about this within my context, right? I think that becomes really interesting, right? How do I do just enough work to move the conversation forward? I think that goes a long way, and that works. That's excellent. And then I really am a big fan of when you're actually looking to do discovery work. David Bland and Alex Osterwalder's book "Testing Business Ideas" is an encyclopedia of 44 well illustrated, beautifully documented experiments for any context, right? And it's a massively successful book. And so I'm happy to give it even more love because it's a reference book, right? You don't have to sit there and kind of read all 44 experiments. You're like, okay, I need to learn X in this context. And then you just kind of dial it in that book. And it's like, okay, here are 3 experiments you can run to do that and how to do them and what you would learn. So Testing Business Ideas by David Bland, amazing book.
Awesome. Well, I do see a couple of questions popping up here, and somebody who shared that they just had a couple of magic light bulb moments. So thank you both for that. Osni has a question. Why is it so difficult for traditional developers to work with UX in the same sprint or at the same pace?
I can take that if you want.
I was going to ask. I was just going to ask if traditional means old. But go ahead, John.
So essentially, one of the first things is make the work for discovery. If you do have a discovery person on the team, UX designer, researcher on the team, if that's one of the kind of assumptions in Scrum, for example, it doesn't have to be the case, of course, with Kanban. But if you did have someone on the team, you'd make the work visible on the backlog in Kanban. If you had a backlog, a product backlog in Scrum. You would also make the work transparent on the sprint backlog in Scrum. In Kanban, you'd make it visible across your workflow. So first of all, we'd understand what we need to do. The other thing is you need to, when you're looking at the workflow, there's policies on the workflow where you have, for example, exit criteria. So if you did have, for example, a discovery column and maybe a development column on your board, I mentioned earlier you might not do that, but if you did have that, you'd have exit criteria in there specifying how do we know when discovery is done. Now, this is one of the problems with discovery because we're never done with discovery. It's really interesting, right? So there needs to be a nuanced discussion there in the team about what that means. But I guess worst case scenario, teams can agree when they create the work items, what is the work that they're going to do in that particular item when they're doing the right sizing, and the development people as well can talk about that as well. I think in most teams, whether you're using Kanban or Scrum or whatever you're using, most teams have some kind of a daily sync up, daily Scrum, daily meeting, whatever you want to do. And I think what would be important would be for people who are representing discovery and delivery to be talking about their work and making that transparent so we're aware, and also making that work visible on the workflow as well, so that we're getting signals about what's happening. Where are we getting overloaded? Where do we need where we need to learn a little bit more about each other's work? And often it's really the biggest problems tend to be more about misunderstanding and not even understanding, being ignorant even of what the other people do, what both ways, discovery, delivery, and the other way around.
Yeah, I always find a lot of value in that for that exact reason, John. I think it's easy to assume a lot of stuff is happening in the other part of the business when we don't have that conversation about the end game. Jeff, there's a question here from Priscilla. You mentioned model behavior. What is valuable about this to the team? And I think that was maybe modeling the behavior around failure, I think.
Yeah. So modeling is particularly if you're, like I said, like if you're any kind of a leadership role, right? Whether it's team leadership or program or departmental or executive leadership, if you can model the behavior you want to see in your teams, it will make them feel more comfortable doing that. So we talked about how do you make it safe to be wrong, right? One of the ways that you make it safe to be wrong, if you're in a leadership position, is to admit to your teams that you were wrong in front of them, right? To show that, hey, I can own it. I made a mistake. I'm not infallible. I can't predict the future like you. I've got, and I think I'll give you an example. This was about 6 or 7 years ago. Josh and I were doing some executive coaching at one of the big banks in the US. And it was with the president of the bank and the whole leadership team. And it was about, these were people who were fantastic at running a bank, but now they were running an agile software company, right? That happened to be in the banking space. And so they were struggling a little bit with agile and technology. And so we were helping them with organizational agility. And after about 6 months of working together, at the end of one of our sessions, the president of the bank had a subsequent meeting with 150 of his members of his organization. He doesn't have 150 directs, but it was like all the EVPs and the SVPs in the bank. And there's a lot of those, as you know. And he said 3 words to them at the beginning of because he had just come out of the session with us. And he said, "Agile is hard." Literally, that's all he said. And I got to tell you, my cell phone blew up because we were working with other teams inside the organization. Like literally, it was like, bzz, 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 bzz. Oh my God, what did you tell him? Oh my God, he gets it. Holy crap. Like he knows what we're talking about, right? Oh, finally, I can breathe easy. Like he understands that this is hard, right? Those 3 words alone, that tiny bit of humility shown by a guy who typically didn't show a whole lot of humility to his direct reports, admitting that this particular transition that the organization was going through was difficult, even without any detail, right? Just agile is hard. All of a sudden, people breathed a sigh of relief because now they can come back. You remember you said agile is hard? Here's how it's hard for us, right? And so help us get through that. And so he modeled, even if he didn't do it knowingly or explicitly, he modeled this behavior that said, I acknowledge that this wasn't exactly how I thought it would be. And now we're willing to kind of change our minds a little bit. And to me, that's massively valuable because now they can actually move forward and get better. And that's really, really important.
Yeah, I love that example. Agile is hard.
It is.
Well, I think we've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more here. Emily Cook has a question. What are 1 or 2 bad habits a UX designer just starting out can avoid to save pain later?
I'll jump in really quick with one, and I'm thinking about this a lot as my daughter is just started college and she's entering the family business, the UX business, if you will. And so I've been thinking a lot about advice for her. And the one thing I would say, my response is don't be precious about the work. And this is key to everything that we've talked about here today. This is a collaborative effort. You play a role in the process. Share your work, build that trust, build that transparency, build that collaboration, and you'll be infinitely more successful.
Yeah. Humility, humanity, and humor.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love
John,
it.
any advice from you?
Yeah, I think something that we need in any team really, but particularly when you're combining discovery and delivery or doing either or, we need to learn how to make decisions. Because sometimes we can spin our wheels a little bit about not really agreeing how we're going to go forward. We get the results of some experiment. They're not conclusive. The team is struggling to make a decision about what they want to do. And maybe you can try things like disagree and commit, pick your poison, but pick some approach so that when the team is discussing something, they know how to overcome and know how to make decisions. I love what Emily said. Humility is a big thing. And for me, discovery is like metaphorically, it's the same as getting into a boxing ring with a sparring partner who just hands it to you. It's when you do discovery, I learned that most of my ideas are wrong, and it's not unusual apparently. So having that humility, being ready to be wrong, and being ready to be convinced about something else by not just by the data, but also by talking to customers and end users. I think sometimes in big organizations we forget, even though we know, we forget. We need someone to hit a reset button to remind us to talk to the customers. Because as Jeff said earlier, we know we need to talk to them, but we don't do it. Life is easy to talk, not so easy to live, right? So
Yeah,
something to
absolutely.
bear in mind.
Well, I want to thank Jeff and John for joining us for this awesome conversation today. This was wonderful. We will post this recording to the Kanban for Everyone playlist on the ProKanban.org YouTube channel. So if you'd like to share what you saw today with anybody who wasn't able to join, we'll post all of our recordings there, and we'll include some of the references that were noted in the chat here, like links to the Lean Canvas, some books and some podcasts and blog posts around how Kanban can help UX teams with visibility, small batch size, folding and learning, responding to feedback and data. Thank you both for joining us today, and we really appreciate your time, and thank you everybody for posting in the comments and the questions. Hope to see everybody join us in 2 weeks where we will be talking about Kanban for education.